When a veterinarian coldly refused to treat a pregnant dog brought into his clinic, he thought nothing of it. What he didn't know was that the dog had recently been adopted by someone he could never afford to upset, his own boss. The day had begun like any other at Brewood Veterinary Clinic, a bustling place known for its commitment to caring for animals. Yet, unbeknownst to the staff, a moment of reckoning was approaching, one that would reveal the true colors of everyone involved. Among the usual flow of pet owners, Mrs. Harper entered the clinic, holding a trembling, heavily pregnant dog. The stray had wandered into her yard just days ago, frightened and malnourished. Mrs. Harper had taken it upon herself to nurse the dog back to health, growing attached to the gentle creature in the process. But today, as labor began, it was clear the dog needed professional help. She approached the receptionist, her voice tinged with urgency. "This dog is in labor, and I think something's wrong," she explained. The receptionist offered a brief nod, typing into her computer before saying, "Please wait a moment. I'll inform Dr. Lawson." Dr. Lawson, a no-nonsense veterinarian with a reputation for efficiency over warmth, arrived moments later. She glanced at the dog briefly, her expression neutral, before shifting her attention to Mrs. Harper. "What's the issue?" Mrs. Harper explained the situation, her concern evident. However, Dr. Lawson's reaction was far from reassuring. "We're understaffed and overbooked," she said with a dismissive wave. "Besides, strays like this always have complications. This is why people shouldn't meddle in things they can't handle." Mrs. Harper was stunned. She had expected compassion but was met with cold indifference. Dr. Lawson instructed her to wait, but there was no promise of immediate attention. As Mrs. Harper sat in the corner with the trembling dog, another figure entered the clinic, a man whose arrival would change everything. He was calm yet commanding, someone the staff recognized immediately, Dr. Everett, the clinic's founder and Dr. Lawson's boss. And in his hand, he held the adoption papers for the very dog she had just dismissed. Dr. Everett's presence in the clinic was an uncommon occurrence. Though he had founded Brewood Veterinary Clinic years ago, he rarely visited, having entrusted the day-to-day operations to his team. When he walked in that morning, the entire staff stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances. His reputation for excellence was unmatched, and his calm demeanor masked a sharp intuition that saw through pretense. He approached the front desk, his keen eyes scanning the waiting room. His gaze settled on Mrs. Harper and the pregnant dog nestled in her lap. The dog, sensing a kindred spirit, let out a soft whine. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," Dr. Everett greeted warmly, noticing her discomfort. "What brings you in today?" Mrs. Harper stood, relief flooding her face. "Dr. Everett, thank goodness you're here. I found this dog a few days ago. She's pregnant and was doing fine until this morning. Now, I think something's wrong." She hesitated, glancing at the staff behind the desk. "I haven't been able to get her seen yet." Dr. Everett's brow furrowed as he crouched down to gently stroke the dog's head. The animal immediately relaxed under his touch. "Don't worry. We'll take care of her." He straightened and turned to the receptionist. "Who's on duty?" "Dr. Lawson, sir," she replied, her voice faltering slightly under his steady gaze. "Good," he said with a nod. "Where is she?" Before the receptionist could answer, Dr. Lawson stepped out of an exam room, clipboard in hand. She froze when she saw Dr. Everett, her usual confidence replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Dr. Everett," she greeted, forcing a smile. "This is a surprise." "Indeed," he replied, his tone measured. "I understand you've been made aware of this dog's condition. Why hasn't she been seen yet?" Dr. Lawson's smile faltered. "I was going to get to it, but as you know, we're short-staffed today, and I didn't think a stray was a priority. We have other patients who—" Dr. Everett raised a hand, silencing her excuses. "Every animal that walks through this door deserves our care, regardless of their background. This clinic was built on that principle. Or have you forgotten?" Dr. Lawson flushed, but she quickly masked her embarrassment with indignation. "With all due respect, Dr. Everett, this isn't about principles. It's about practicality. Strays come with complications, and we can't always dedicate resources to them." Her words hung in the air, met by a heavy silence. Mrs. Harper's face reflected her disbelief, while the other staff members exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Everett's voice, calm yet firm, broke the tension. "I appreciate the challenges of running a clinic, Dr. Lawson. But practicality does not excuse negligence. This dog is not just any stray." He held up the adoption papers. "She's under my care now. And as of yesterday, she has a name, Daisy." Dr. Lawson's face went pale. She opened her mouth to respond but found no words. Turning to Mrs. Harper, Dr. Everett offered an apologetic smile. "I'm deeply sorry for the delay. Daisy is in good hands now. Let's get her examined immediately." He motioned to a younger vet technician standing nearby. "Prepare the exam room and bring the ultrasound equipment. I'll be overseeing this case personally." The staff sprang into action, the energy in the clinic shifting as everyone followed Dr. Everett's lead. Daisy was gently carried into the exam room, where the team began the initial assessment. Mrs. Harper, though still shaken, felt a wave of reassurance watching Dr. Everett work. His gentle demeanor with Daisy contrasted sharply with Dr. Lawson's cold detachment. As the ultrasound revealed Daisy's condition, Dr. Everett explained everything to Mrs. Harper in clear, compassionate terms. "It looks like Daisy is having some difficulty due to malnutrition before you found her," he said. "Her puppies are small but healthy, and with a bit of care, she should deliver safely." Relief washed over Mrs. Harper. "Thank you, Dr. Everett. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Dr. Everett smiled. "The real thanks go to you. You saved her life by bringing her here. Let's make sure she and her puppies get through this safely." In the waiting room, Dr. Lawson stood frozen, grappling with the weight of her actions. The realization that she had dismissed not only an animal in need but also her boss's personal pet gnawed at her pride. But Dr. Everett wasn't done. After ensuring Daisy was comfortable and stabilized, he stepped out of the exam room and approached Dr. Lawson. His gaze was steady, but there was no anger, only disappointment. "Dr. Lawson, we need to have a conversation about what happened here today," he said, his voice low yet commanding. Dr. Lawson swallowed hard, nodding. She knew this was only the beginning of the reckoning she would face. Dr. Lawson followed Dr. Everett into his office, her nerves evident in her stiff posture and averted gaze. She had been with the clinic for years, working her way up to a trusted senior position. Yet now, the weight of her decisions loomed over her, and she could feel her credibility slipping with every step. Dr. Everett gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, sitting down with a measured calm. He took a moment before speaking, letting the silence settle heavily between them. "Dr. Lawson," he began, his voice even, "I built this clinic with a vision to provide compassionate, unwavering care to every animal that comes through our doors. It's a simple principle, but one that must guide everything we do. Today, I saw that principle ignored." Dr. Lawson shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, Dr. Everett, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But I thought, what you thought," he interrupted gently but firmly, "was that Daisy didn't matter because she was a stray. But let me remind you, Dr. Lawson, every life matters here, no matter their origin or circumstances. That's not just a clinic policy, it's our ethos." She looked down, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "I was overwhelmed. We've been understaffed for weeks, and I made a bad call. I should have handled it differently." Dr. Everett nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand the pressures you're under. But pressure doesn't absolve us of our duty. It's in moments like these that our principles are tested. Today, you failed that test." The words stung, but they were delivered without malice. Dr. Lawson felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized the gravity of her mistake, not just professionally, but ethically. Dr. Everett leaned forward, his gaze piercing yet compassionate. "This isn't just about Daisy. It's about every animal and owner who trusts us to provide care. I need to know that every member of this team understands the weight of that responsibility. Can I trust you to uphold it moving forward?" Dr. Lawson nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Dr. Everett. You have my word. This will never happen again." Satisfied, Dr. Everett leaned back, his demeanor softening further. "Good. Then let's learn from this and ensure it doesn't happen again. For now, I want you to oversee Daisy's care. Consider it an opportunity to demonstrate the compassion and professionalism I know you're capable of." Dr. Lawson blinked, surprised by the trust he was extending despite her error. "I won't let you down," she said earnestly. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Lawson left the office with a renewed determination. She knew she had a long road to rebuild trust, not just with Dr. Everett, but with herself. Meanwhile, in the exam room, Daisy lay comfortably on a soft blanket, her breathing steady as the medications began to ease her discomfort. Mrs. Harper sat nearby, gently stroking Daisy's fur while speaking soothingly to her. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're going to take care of you and those babies." Dr. Everett returned, his presence bringing a sense of calm. He crouched beside Daisy, checking her vitals with practiced ease. "She's responding well to treatment," he said with a reassuring smile. "We'll keep her here for a few days to monitor her and make sure she's ready for delivery." Mrs. Harper nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Dr. Everett. I knew she needed help, but I was starting to lose hope when no one would listen." Dr. Everett's expression grew thoughtful. "Hope is what keeps us going, Mrs. Harper. Thank you for not giving up on her. It's people like you who remind us why we do this work." As he spoke, the door opened, and Dr. Lawson stepped in, carrying a clipboard and a gentle demeanor. She approached cautiously, her eyes meeting Dr. Everett's briefly before turning to Daisy. "I'd like to take over Daisy's care," she said softly, "if that's okay with you, Mrs. Harper." Mrs. Harper hesitated for a moment, glancing at Dr. Everett. At his encouraging nod, she gave a small smile. "Of course. Daisy needs all the care she can get." Dr. Lawson knelt beside the dog, her movements slow and deliberate. She checked Daisy's vitals, speaking in a soft tone that seemed to put both the dog and Mrs. Harper at ease. As she worked, Dr. Everett watched quietly, noting the sincerity in her actions. Perhaps this was the beginning of a transformation, he thought, a chance for her to rediscover the compassion that had brought her to this profession in the first place. Back at the front desk, the rest of the staff whispered amongst themselves, the atmosphere charged with curiosity and unease. The events of the morning had left a mark, and they couldn't help but wonder what it all meant for the clinic. One of the younger technicians, Emily, turned to her colleague. "Do you think Dr. Lawson will really change?" Her colleague shrugged. "If anyone can make her see the light, it's Dr. Everett. But it'll take more than one act of kindness to fix things." Emily nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting toward the exam room where Dr. Lawson was now diligently caring for Daisy. Maybe, just maybe, things were beginning to shift. The next morning, Daisy's condition appeared stable, and the clinic buzzed with its usual activity. The waiting room filled with owners and their pets, and the staff moved efficiently through their routines. Dr. Lawson, now solely responsible for Daisy, had spent hours by her side, monitoring her vitals and ensuring her comfort. As she reviewed Daisy's chart, she noticed something unusual. The details Mrs. Harper had provided about Daisy's history were sparse, but there was a notation about an identification chip. Intrigued, Dr. Lawson decided to scan Daisy, her professional curiosity piqued. She gently approached Daisy, who wagged her tail faintly. "Let's see if we can learn a little more about you," Dr. Lawson murmured as she ran the scanner over Daisy's side. A soft beep confirmed the presence of a microchip, and the scanner displayed a registration number. Dr. Lawson quickly jotted it down and accessed the clinic's database. As she entered the information, her breath caught. The microchip was registered not to a random owner but to Brewood Veterinary Clinic itself. Confused, she delved deeper into the records, and what she discovered left her stunned. Daisy had been a part of a rescue effort spearheaded by Dr. Everett himself several months ago. The records detailed how Daisy had been found as part of a group of abandoned dogs. She had been brought to the clinic in poor health, nursed back to stability, and later released to a foster program. Dr. Everett had personally signed off on her care and planned to adopt her when she was ready. Dr. Lawson leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation settling over her. Not only was Daisy tied to the clinic's history, but she was also a personal connection to Dr. Everett. Her earlier dismissal of the dog's needs now felt even more shameful. She glanced toward the hallway where Dr. Everett's office door stood slightly ajar. Summoning her courage, she stood and walked purposefully toward him, clutching the printout of Daisy's records. Inside the office, Dr. Everett was immersed in paperwork, his focus unbroken until Dr. Lawson's knock interrupted his thoughts. He looked up, surprised but composed. "Dr. Lawson," he greeted, gesturing for her to enter. "What can I do for you?" She stepped in, her expression a mixture of regret and determination. "I wanted to share something about Daisy," she began, handing him the printout. Dr. Everett scanned the document, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. He leaned back, letting out a thoughtful sigh. "So, she's come full circle," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "I had no idea," Dr. Lawson admitted, her voice laced with guilt. "If I'd known, he held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "You didn't know, and yet the principle remains. Every animal deserves our care, not just the ones with personal connections to us. Daisy's story only underscores why we must never waver in our commitment." Dr. Lawson nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "I want to do better, Dr. Everett, not just for Daisy, but for the clinic. I've lost sight of what brought me to this field, and I need to change that." Dr. Everett regarded her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. Let's see how you follow through. Meanwhile, in the recovery room, Daisy's condition showed steady improvement. Mrs. Harper, ever vigilant, stayed by her side. As she gently stroked Daisy's fur, she noticed a flicker of movement from the pregnant dog. Daisy shifted slightly, her ears perking up as though she sensed something important. Mrs. Harper smiled. "You're a fighter, aren't you, girl? Those puppies of yours are going to be just fine." As if in response, Daisy let out a soft bark, her eyes glinting with determination. Unbeknownst to them, a storm was brewing. The revelation of Daisy's connection to Dr. Everett was only the beginning. There was more to her story, hidden threads that would soon unravel, drawing everyone in the clinic into a web of unexpected truths and challenges. Dr. Lawson left Dr. Everett's office with a renewed sense of purpose. The revelation about Daisy's connection to the clinic weighed heavily on her, but it also motivated her to prove her commitment. She returned to the recovery room, where Mrs. Harper sat beside Daisy, the two of them sharing a quiet moment of connection. "Mrs. Harper," Dr. Lawson began gently, walking in with her clipboard, "how is Daisy doing this morning?" Mrs. Harper glanced up, her face softening. "She's doing better. Her breathing seems more relaxed, and she even wagged her tail earlier." Dr. Lawson crouched beside Daisy, her touch gentle and deliberate as she checked the dog's vitals. "That's a good sign. She's responding well to treatment, and her vitals look stable. We'll continue to monitor her closely, but I think she's on the mend." Mrs. Harper smiled but still looked concerned. "What about her puppies? Do you think they'll be okay?" Dr. Lawson paused, meeting Mrs. Harper's gaze. "We're cautiously optimistic. Daisy's strong, and she's fighting for them. We'll do everything we can to make sure she has a safe delivery." Mrs. Harper let out a breath of relief, her hand resting on Daisy's head. "Thank you, Dr. Lawson. That means the world to me." For the first time, Dr. Lawson felt a flicker of warmth in the interaction. This wasn't just about redemption, it was about making a difference. She had let her clinical detachment guide her for too long, and now she saw the cost of that approach. Elsewhere in the clinic, Dr. Everett gathered the staff for a brief meeting. He knew the events surrounding Daisy had sparked conversations among his team, and he wanted to address them head-on. The team assembled in the break room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Dr. Everett stood at the front, his demeanor calm but firm. "Thank you all for taking a few minutes to meet," he began. "As most of you know, we've had an unusual situation with a patient recently, Daisy, the pregnant dog brought in by Mrs. Harper. This situation has brought to light some challenges we need to address as a team." The staff exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. "Our mission," Dr. Everett continued, "is to provide compassionate care to every animal that comes through our doors, regardless of their circumstances. Daisy's story is a reminder of why we do what we do, and why every decision we make matters." He let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "I've spoken to Dr. Lawson, and she's taking steps to ensure that her actions align with our values moving forward. But this isn't just about one person. It's about all of us and how we uphold the standards of care that define this clinic." Emily, one of the younger technicians, raised her hand. "Dr. Everett, what can we do to make sure something like this doesn't happen again?" Dr. Everett smiled at the question. "Great point, Emily. We're going to implement additional training sessions focused on compassionate care and ethical decision-making. I also encourage open communication. If you ever feel something isn't right, speak up. We're a team, and we rely on each other to uphold our mission." The staff murmured their agreement, and Dr. Everett felt a sense of optimism. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a step in the right direction. Back in the recovery room, Dr. Lawson stayed close to Daisy, her focus unwavering. She reviewed every aspect of the dog's care plan, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Mrs. Harper watched her work, a faint smile on her lips. "You know," Mrs. Harper said after a moment, "I wasn't sure what to think of you at first, but I can see how much you care now." Dr. Lawson paused, glancing at Mrs. Harper. "I appreciate that. I've made mistakes, but I'm committed to making things right, not just for Daisy, but for every animal I care for." Mrs. Harper nodded. "That's all anyone can ask for. We all make mistakes, but it's what we do afterward that shows who we really are." Dr. Lawson felt a wave of gratitude for Mrs. Harper's understanding. It wasn't forgiveness she sought, but an opportunity to prove herself, and Mrs. Harper's words gave her the encouragement she needed to keep moving forward. As the day went on, Daisy's progress continued, and the atmosphere in the clinic began to shift. The staff worked with renewed purpose, their interactions more thoughtful and deliberate. Dr. Everett made rounds, checking in with each team member and ensuring that everyone felt supported in their roles. When Dr. Everett returned to the recovery room that evening, he found Dr. Lawson still at Daisy's side, her dedication evident in the meticulous notes she had compiled. "How's she doing?" Dr. Everett asked, his tone warm but professional. "Stable and showing improvement," Dr. Lawson replied. "I've updated her care plan and scheduled additional monitoring overnight." Dr. Everett nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good work, Dr. Lawson. Daisy's in good hands." The words, simple as they were, carried a weight of validation that Dr. Lawson hadn't expected. She met Dr. Everett's gaze and felt a sense of renewal. This was why she had entered veterinary medicine in the first place, to make a difference, one patient at a time. The next morning, as the clinic prepared for another busy day, Dr. Everett received an unexpected call. It was from a local animal rescue organization. They had heard about Daisy's story through Mrs. Harper, who had shared her experience on a community forum the previous evening. The rescue's director, a passionate advocate for animal welfare named Rebecca Ortiz, expressed both concern and interest in learning more about Daisy's situation. "Dr. Everett," Rebecca began, her voice firm yet kind, "we've seen too many cases of animals like Daisy falling through the cracks. I'd like to collaborate with your clinic to ensure that dogs like her receive not only the care they need but the respect they deserve." Dr. Everett welcomed the opportunity. He agreed to meet with Rebecca later that week to discuss how the clinic could better serve at-risk animals. The conversation was a step forward, but it also highlighted a deeper challenge: changing public perception. News of the incident with Daisy had begun to spread, and while some saw the clinic's response as commendable, others were critical of the initial mishandling. Meanwhile, in the recovery room, Daisy's condition had improved significantly. She wagged her tail when Emily, the veterinary technician, approached her with breakfast. The playful sparkle in her eyes had returned, and her movements were less labored. "Good girl," Emily cooed, gently scratching behind Daisy's ears. "You're going to be just fine." Mrs. Harper, who had stayed overnight in the clinic's guest quarters, entered the room carrying a cup of coffee. Her eyes lit up at the sight of Daisy's progress. "She's a fighter," Mrs. Harper said, her voice filled with pride. "I've never met a dog with so much spirit." Emily nodded. "She is. And her puppies will have her strength too. We'll make sure of it." Just as things seemed to be settling, another challenge emerged. Midway through the morning, one of the newer staff members, a young vet tech named Brian, expressed concerns about the clinic's capacity to handle additional cases like Daisy's. He approached Dr. Lawson in the hallway, his expression troubled. "Dr. Lawson, can I talk to you for a second?" Brian asked. "Of course," she replied, stopping mid-step. "What's on your mind?" "It's just, cases like Daisy's, they're so time-intensive. I mean, I understand why we're doing it, but what if we get overwhelmed? We only have so many resources." Dr. Lawson took a deep breath, understanding his concerns. "You're right, Brian. Cases like Daisy's do require a lot of attention. But this is why we're here, to make a difference when it matters most. Yes, it's challenging, but it's also what defines us as a clinic." Brian hesitated, then nodded. "I see your point. I just hope we can balance everything." Dr. Lawson offered him a reassuring smile. "We will. And if we ever feel stretched too thin, we'll find solutions together. You're not alone in this." Later that day, the clinic received another unexpected visitor. A man in a tailored suit arrived, his demeanor both commanding and composed. It was Mr. Harper, Mrs. Harper's husband, and one of the town's most influential figures. Though he was known for his business acumen, he had a soft spot for animals, a trait that had endeared him to his wife. Dr. Everett greeted him personally, aware of the gravity his presence carried. "Mr. Harper, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for visiting." "Dr. Everett," Mr. Harper said, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about your clinic, both good and concerning. I wanted to see for myself how things are being handled." Dr. Everett nodded, his tone professional. "I assure you, we've taken every step to ensure Daisy and her puppies receive the best care. I can personally guarantee she's in excellent hands." "I trust my wife's judgment," Mr. Harper replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I also believe in accountability. If there's room for improvement, I expect you to address it." Dr. Everett met his gaze steadily. "We are. Daisy's case has been a wake-up call for all of us, and we're committed to making lasting changes." Mr. Harper softened slightly, his stern expression giving way to a faint smile. Good. My wife is very fond of Daisy, and as her husband, I want to see that both Daisy and this clinic thrive. As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the clinic shifted. The staff, inspired by the dedication of Mrs. Harper and the unexpected visit from her husband, worked with renewed vigor. Dr. Lawson, in particular, poured her energy into Daisy's care, ensuring every detail was meticulously handled. By the evening, Daisy showed signs of preparing for delivery. Her breathing became more focused, and she began nesting, a clear indication that the puppies were on their way. Mrs. Harper stayed by her side, her excitement tempered by concern. You've got this, Daisy, she whispered, stroking the dog's fur. We're all here for you. Dr. Lawson entered the room, her presence calm and reassuring. It's time, she said gently. Let's get ready. The clinic buzzed with quiet urgency as the team prepared for Daisy's delivery. Mrs. Harper stood by, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest, her heart racing with anticipation. Emily and Brian worked efficiently, arranging the equipment and making sure everything was sanitized and within reach. Dr. Lawson, now fully immersed in her role, orchestrated the preparations with precision. Daisy lay on the padded delivery area, her breathing deep and steady. Her eyes darted around the room, filled with a mix of exhaustion and trust. She looked at Mrs. Harper, who knelt beside her, whispering soft words of encouragement. You're doing great, Daisy, Mrs. Harper murmured, her voice soothing. We're all here with you. You're not alone. Dr. Everett entered the room to lend his support. How's she doing? He asked Dr. Lawson. She's progressing well, Dr. Lawson replied, keeping her focus on Daisy. Her vitals are stable, and she's showing strong instincts. It's just a matter of time now. As the first puppy began to crown, the room grew tense. Daisy whined softly, her body straining with the effort. Mrs. Harper reached out, gently stroking her head. You can do it, sweet girl, she whispered. You're so strong. The puppy emerged slowly, its tiny form slick and fragile. Dr. Lawson quickly stepped in, using a sterile towel to clean it and stimulate its breathing. After a moment of suspense, a soft, high-pitched squeak filled the room. The team exhaled collectively, their relief palpable. It's a boy, Dr. Lawson announced with a small smile. She handed the puppy to Emily, who gently placed him beside Daisy. The mother dog instinctively began to clean her newborn, her maternal instincts taking over. Mrs. Harper's eyes filled with tears. He's perfect, she said, her voice trembling. As more puppies followed, the room became a flurry of activity. Each delivery brought a mix of tension and joy, the team working seamlessly to ensure every pup was healthy and cared for. By the time the last puppy arrived, Daisy was surrounded by a small, wriggling litter, each one a testament to her strength and resilience. The team marveled at the sight, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of such a miraculous moment. Mrs. Harper couldn't contain her joy, her hands trembling as she counted the tiny puppies. 7, she said, her voice filled with wonder. She had 7 beautiful puppies. Dr. Lawson nodded, her professional demeanor softening. They're all strong and healthy, thanks to Daisy and to you, Mrs. Harper. Your care and love made all the difference. Mrs. Harper wiped away tears, her heart full. No, it's thanks to all of you. You gave her a chance when she needed it most. As the team began to clean up, the emotional weight of the experience settled over the room. Brian, who had earlier expressed doubts about the clinic's capacity, approached Dr. Lawson, his face a mixture of guilt and newfound respect. Dr. Lawson, he began hesitantly, I just wanted to say, I was wrong. Seeing what Daisy went through and how you handled everything. I understand now why this work matters so much. Dr. Lawson looked at him, her expression thoughtful. It's okay, Brian. This job isn't easy, and it's natural to question things. But what we do here, it's worth it. Every life we touch is worth it. Brian nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'm glad I get to be part of this team. Meanwhile, Dr. Everett pulled Mrs. Harper aside for a private conversation. I wanted to thank you for trusting us with Daisy, he said. Your faith in our clinic means a lot, especially after everything that's happened. Mrs. Harper smiled, her eyes warm. You've more than earned my trust, Dr. Everett. Daisy and her puppies are alive because of your team's dedication. That's something I'll never forget. Dr. Everett hesitated, then added, I also want to apologize for the initial mishandling of Daisy's case. It was a failure on our part, and I take full responsibility. We're taking steps to ensure it never happens again. Mrs. Harper reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Your apology is accepted. What matters is that you're willing to learn and grow from this. That's all anyone can ask. As the night wore on, the clinic quieted. Daisy and her puppies rested peacefully in a warm, comfortable space. Mrs. Harper sat nearby, unable to take her eyes off the small family she had come to love so deeply. Dr. Lawson lingered for a moment before leaving the room, her heart heavy with both exhaustion and gratitude. She had faced her shortcomings and found a way to move forward. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the routine of her job. Dr. Everett watched her leave, a quiet pride in his eyes. The events of the past days had been challenging, but they had also brought his team closer together and reminded them of why they had chosen this profession in the first place. As the first light of dawn filtered through the clinic's windows, the once bustling facility grew quiet. Daisy and her puppies were peacefully sleeping, their rhythmic breaths filling the room with a sense of calm. Mrs. Harper sat nearby, cradling a cup of coffee as she reflected on the extraordinary events of the past 24 hours. Despite the joy of the successful delivery, a nagging thought lingered in her mind: how close Daisy had come to being turned away. This lingering concern was shared by Dr. Everett, who found himself pacing in his office. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. The incident had been a stark reminder of the cracks in the clinic system, cracks that, if left unaddressed, could cost lives. As he sifted through paperwork, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening his posture. Rebecca Ortiz, the director of the local rescue organization, stepped inside, her expression a mix of determination and concern. "Good morning, Dr. Everett," she began, closing the door behind her. "I've been thinking a lot about Daisy's case. It's clear she's lucky to have had someone like Mrs. Harper advocating for her. But what about the animals who don't? How many others have slipped through the cracks?" Dr. Everett nodded, his brow furrowed. "You're right, Rebecca. This case has been a wake-up call for all of us. We need to do better, not just as a clinic, but as a community." Rebecca leaned forward, her tone resolute. "I'd like to propose a partnership between the clinic and the rescue. We can create a safety net for animals like Daisy, ensuring they receive the care they need regardless of circumstances. Together, we can make a real difference." Meanwhile, in the clinic's main hallway, Emily was briefing Brian on their plans for the day. While their conversation started casually, it took an unexpected turn when a man entered the building. His face was shadowed by a baseball cap, and he moved quickly, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the reception desk. "I'm here about the doc," he said gruffly, his voice low. Emily exchanged a glance with Brian before stepping forward. "Are you referring to Daisy?" she asked cautiously. The man nodded. "That's her name. I found her a few weeks ago near an old construction site. She was skinny and scared, so I fed her for a while. But then one day, she disappeared. I figured she'd been picked up by someone." Emily's heart sank. The man's tone was neither warm nor hostile, but his presence raised questions. Was he there to reclaim Daisy? And if so, what were his intentions? "Daisy was brought in by Mrs. Harper," Emily explained carefully. "She's given birth to her puppies and is doing well." The man's eyes flickered with something resembling relief, though it was fleeting. "I just wanted to make sure she was okay," he muttered before turning to leave. "Wait," Emily called out, stepping closer. "Can you tell us more about where you found her? It might help us understand her situation better." The man hesitated, then nodded. "There's an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. That's where she was hiding. It's not safe there, lots of broken glass and rusted metal. I'm glad she found someone who cares." With that, he walked out, leaving Emily and Brian to process the encounter. Emily's mind raced. The mention of the warehouse painted a troubling picture of Daisy's past. What other dangers might she have faced before crossing paths with Mrs. Harper? Back in the recovery room, Mrs. Harper noticed that Daisy seemed unusually restless. Though the puppies were feeding well and appeared healthy, Daisy occasionally lifted her head, her ears perking up as if listening for something. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" Mrs. Harper asked softly, stroking Daisy's head. The dog's tail wagged faintly, but her eyes carried a hint of unease. Dr. Lawson entered the room, her expression calm but observant. "How's she doing?" she asked. "She seems distracted," Mrs. Harper replied. "Almost like she's looking for something, or someone." Dr. Lawson knelt beside Daisy, examining her carefully. "It could just be residual anxiety from her time in the wild," she said thoughtfully. "But let's keep an eye on her behavior." As the day progressed, Daisy's unease persisted. Though she cared for her puppies attentively, there were moments when she would pace the recovery room, her nose pressed to the door. Mrs. Harper grew increasingly concerned, her heart aching for the dog who had already endured so much. By late afternoon, Dr. Everett called an impromptu staff meeting to discuss the clinic's future. Rebecca Ortiz joined them, bringing insights from the rescue community. Together, they brainstormed ideas to improve the clinic's protocols and expand its outreach. "We need to address accessibility," Rebecca said firmly. "Too many animals are falling through the cracks because of financial or logistical barriers. A partnership with local rescues could help bridge that gap." Dr. Lawson nodded. "We also need to rebuild trust within the community. Transparency and accountability are key." As the meeting continued, Emily shared the encounter with the man who had found Daisy. His mention of the warehouse lingered in her mind, raising questions about other animals that might still be in danger. "We should investigate that site," she suggested. "If Daisy was hiding there, there could be others who need our help." Dr. Everett agreed, though he cautioned against rushing in without proper planning. "Let's coordinate with Rebecca and her team. If there are other animals in need, we'll be ready." The mention of the warehouse added an air of intrigue to an already complex situation. While the clinic had made great strides in addressing its shortcomings, the lingering shadows of Daisy's past hinted at challenges yet to come. The following morning, the clinic buzzed with cautious anticipation as plans were set into motion to investigate the warehouse where Daisy had been found. Emily, ever the dedicated advocate for animals, had volunteered to accompany Rebecca Ortiz and her rescue team. Brian, who was still grappling with guilt over his initial doubts about the clinic's mission, surprised everyone by offering to join them. "I want to help," he said firmly, his voice carrying an air of determination. "If there are other animals out there like Daisy, I need to make it right." Dr. Everett and Dr. Lawson stayed behind to oversee the clinic's daily operations, but they made it clear that the team had their full support. Before they left, Mrs. Harper stopped by to check on Daisy and her puppies. Though Daisy had seemed more relaxed overnight, there was still a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if she sensed the importance of the team's mission. "You're doing this for her, aren't you?" Mrs. Harper asked Emily, her voice soft but resolute. Emily nodded, her gaze unwavering. "For her, and for all the animals who need someone to care about them." As the team arrived at the warehouse, the air was thick with a mix of apprehension and resolve. The building was as foreboding as the man at the clinic had described, its weathered exterior riddled with broken windows and graffiti. The surrounding lot was littered with debris, creating a sense of abandonment that was almost palpable. Rebecca led the way, her flashlight cutting through the dim interior. As they stepped inside, the scent of rust and decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with faint, unfamiliar sounds that hinted at the presence of life. "Stay close," Rebecca warned, her voice low. "Places like this can be dangerous, for both animals and people." Emily and Brian followed closely, their eyes scanning every corner for signs of movement. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Then, from somewhere deeper within the building, came a soft whimper. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her heart quickening. Rebecca nodded, motioning for the group to remain quiet. As they moved toward the sound, the whimper grew louder, joined by faint scratching noises that echoed through the cavernous space. When they rounded a corner, the source of the noise came into view, a small group of dogs huddled together in a makeshift den, their eyes wide with fear. The sight was both heartbreaking and galvanizing. The dogs, though clearly malnourished and wary of humans, showed no signs of aggression. One of them, a scruffy terrier mix, stepped forward hesitantly, its tail wagging faintly despite its obvious fear. Rebecca knelt down, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay," she said gently. "We're here to help." Emily couldn't hold back her emotions as she watched Rebecca extend a hand toward the terrier, who sniffed it cautiously before taking a small step closer. "They're just like Daisy," she murmured, her voice trembling. "They've been through so much, and they're still willing to trust us." Brian, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, stepped forward to help. "We need to get them out of here," he said firmly. "This place isn't safe." Rebecca nodded, her professional instincts kicking in. "We'll take them to the rescue for now. Once they're stabilized, we can decide the best course of action." The team worked together to coax the dogs into crates, their movements slow and deliberate to avoid causing further stress. Though the process was time-consuming, the reward was undeniable. The once frightened animals began to relax, their initial wariness giving way to a tentative sense of security. Back at the clinic, Dr. Everett and Dr. Lawson were busy reviewing files and updating protocols when the team returned with their new charges. The sight of the rescued dogs filled the room with a renewed sense of purpose, reminding everyone why they had chosen this line of work. "These are the survivors," Rebecca said softly as she introduced the dogs to the clinic staff. "But there are so many more out there who need us." Mrs. Harper, who had stayed to care for Daisy and her puppies, watched the scene unfold with tears in her eyes. She approached the terrier, who wagged its tail hesitantly at her approach. "You're safe now," she said gently, her voice filled with emotion. "You're going to be okay." As the clinic worked to integrate the new arrivals into their care routine, the connections among the team grew stronger. Brian, who had once been skeptical of the clinic's mission, found himself deeply moved by the experience. "I never realized how much of a difference we could make," he admitted to Emily as they cleaned the terrier's wounds together. "This isn't just a job, it's a responsibility." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "It's more than that," she said. "It's a calling." Later that evening, as Daisy rested with her puppies, Mrs. Harper reflected on the day's events. Though the journey had been difficult, it had also been transformative. Daisy's story had not only saved her own life but had also inspired a movement to help countless others. "Sometimes, it takes just one life to change the world," Mrs. Harper whispered, her gaze softening as she watched Daisy nuzzle her puppies. "And Daisy, you've done just that." As the clinic staff settled into their evening routines, Emily and Rebecca convened in Dr. Everett's office to discuss their findings at the warehouse. They had expected challenges, but the scale of neglect they uncovered was overwhelming. The conditions the animals had endured were horrifying: filth, malnutrition, and blatant disregard for their well-being. It was clear this operation was no isolated incident. "We can't let this go," Emily said, her voice steady but resolute. "This isn't just about rescuing a few dogs. Whoever is behind this is still out there, and they'll keep doing this unless we stop them." Rebecca nodded, her expression grim. "We've got enough evidence to escalate this. I've already reached out to the local animal welfare authorities, but they'll need more to build a solid case." Dr. Everett, who had been listening intently, leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful look. "What about the man who brought Daisy in?" he asked. "He's our best lead, but he's vanished. If we can find him, we might be able to uncover the network behind this." Meanwhile, Brian had taken a special interest in the terrier they rescued, now named Scout. The dog's timid yet trusting nature had struck a chord with him, and he was determined to help Scout recover fully. However, as he spent more time with Scout, he noticed peculiar behaviors. Scout would occasionally flinch at certain sounds or cower when approached too quickly. It was clear the little dog carried scars, both physical and emotional, from its time in captivity. "Scout's trying so hard to trust us," Brian said to Emily as they worked late into the evening. "But it's like there's a shadow hanging over him." Emily paused, considering his words. "It's not just Scout," she said quietly. "All of these animals carry pieces of their past with them. That's why it's so important we find out who's responsible for this." As if on cue, Rebecca burst into the room, her phone in hand and a look of urgency on her face. "I just got a tip," she said breathlessly. "Someone spotted the man who brought Daisy in. He's been seen around an old storage yard on the outskirts of town." The room fell silent as everyone processed the information. This was their chance to confront the person who had set this entire chain of events into motion, but it wasn't without risk. "Are you sure it's safe?" Brian asked, his concern evident. "If this guy is part of something bigger, he might not be acting alone." Rebecca's expression hardened. "That's why we'll need to be careful. But we can't let this opportunity slip away." Dr. Everett nodded. "I'll inform the authorities. We'll need their support to ensure this is handled properly." The team, accompanied by local animal welfare officers, arrived at the storage yard under the cover of dusk. The sprawling area was eerily quiet, its rows of dilapidated buildings casting long shadows under the fading light. As they moved cautiously through the maze of structures, Emily's heart raced with anticipation. This wasn't just about finding the man, they were on the brink of uncovering a much larger operation. Rebecca led the way, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. It wasn't long before they spotted movement near one of the larger buildings. The man they were looking for was hunched over, rummaging through a crate of supplies. He looked up, startled, as the beams of their flashlights landed on him. "Don't move," one of the officers commanded, stepping forward with authority. The man froze, his eyes darting between the team as if calculating his chances of escape. But before he could act, Rebecca stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "We're not here to hurt you," she said. "We just want to know the truth. Who's behind this?" For a moment, the man seemed torn. Then, with a resigned sigh, he raised his hands in surrender. "It's not just me," he admitted, his voice shaky. "There's a whole network. They take animals, breed them, sell them to the highest bidder. They don't care what happens to them." The revelation sent a wave of shock through the group. The man's confession was more than they had bargained for. It was a window into the dark underbelly of the animal trade. But as he continued to speak, another chilling detail emerged. "They were after Daisy," he said. "She was supposed to be part of a big sale. But when they realized she was pregnant, they didn't want to wait. They were going to put her down. So I took her and ran." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. Daisy's story, already heartbreaking, now carried even greater weight. She had been a commodity, a disposable asset in a cruel system. But one man's small act of defiance had saved her life and set in motion the events that brought her to safety. The officers took the man into custody, promising to follow the leads he provided. For Emily and the team, the night marked a turning point. They had not only rescued Daisy and her puppies but had also exposed a network that thrived on the suffering of innocent animals. It was a victory, but it was far from the end. As they returned to the clinic, their thoughts were heavy with the enormity of the task ahead. The battle they had fought tonight was just the beginning, but in their hearts, they knew it was a fight worth continuing. For Daisy, for Scout, and for all the animals who needed someone to stand up for them. Back at the clinic, the atmosphere was tense yet charged with determination. Emily, Rebecca, Dr. Everett, and Brian gathered in the break room to debrief after the eventful night. The man's confession had provided a grim glimpse into the operations of the animal trafficking network. The details were horrifying, but they also presented an opportunity to dismantle the system that had caused so much suffering. "We need to act quickly," Rebecca said, pacing the room. "If what he said is true, there are still countless animals out there trapped in those conditions." Dr. Everett nodded, his expression somber. "We have enough evidence to push for a full investigation, but we'll need to be strategic. These people won't go down without a fight." Emily, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "We can't just rely on the authorities. We need to make this public. If people see what's happening, there'll be more pressure to act, and faster." Brian, sitting with Scout curled up at his feet, chimed in. "What about Daisy and her puppies? Their story could be the key. People connect with stories, especially ones with a face they can care about." The team decided to use their clinic's social media platforms to share Daisy's journey, highlighting her resilience and the cruelty she had escaped. They carefully crafted a narrative that showcased her transformation from a frightened and neglected dog to a proud mother surrounded by her healthy puppies. The post ended with a call to action, urging their followers to support the ongoing investigation and raise awareness about animal trafficking. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in from people expressing outrage, offering support, and sharing Daisy's story far and wide. Within hours, local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it began to spread beyond the community. But with the attention came challenges. The clinic received anonymous threats, warning them to stop pursuing the matter. One chilling message read, "Stay out of what doesn't concern you, or you'll regret it." Dr. Everett, unshaken, addressed the team. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. If they're trying to intimidate us, it means we're getting close. We can't back down now." Meanwhile, Emily and Brian focused on caring for Daisy and her puppies. Despite the stress of recent events, Daisy's gentle nature shone through as she nursed her pups and interacted with the clinic staff. Scout, too, seemed to draw strength from Daisy's presence, growing more confident with each passing day. One evening, as Emily sat beside Daisy's pen, she found herself reflecting on the bond between the animals. "They've been through so much," she said softly to Brian, who had joined her. "But they haven't given up. It's like they know we're fighting for them." Brian smiled faintly, watching Scout nuzzle up to Daisy. "They remind us why we're doing this. No matter how hard it gets, we owe it to them to keep going." As the investigation gained momentum, the authorities uncovered more locations linked to the trafficking network. Raids were conducted, leading to the rescue of dozens of animals and the arrest of several key players. Each victory brought a sense of relief, but the team knew the fight was far from over. Rebecca, who had been coordinating closely with the investigators, shared updates during their nightly meetings. "The good news is we're making progress," she said. "But the bad news is the people at the top are still out there. They're the ones pulling the strings." Dr. Everett leaned forward, his expression determined. "Then we keep pushing. If we can expose them, we can dismantle the entire operation." As days turned into weeks, Daisy's story continued to inspire people across the country. Donations poured into the clinic, allowing them to expand their efforts and provide better care for the rescued animals. Emily and Brian worked tirelessly, fueled by the outpouring of support and the progress they were making. One afternoon, as Emily was preparing Daisy's pen for a photo shoot with her puppies, Dr. Everett approached her. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful. "We've done a lot here, but this problem is bigger than us. If we want to make a lasting impact, we need to think long-term." Emily looked up, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I want to start a foundation," Dr. Everett said. "A place dedicated to rescuing, rehabilitating, and advocating for animals like Daisy and Scout. We could use the momentum from this case to build something that lasts." Emily's eyes lit up with excitement. "That's an incredible idea. Count me in." The foundation quickly became a reality, thanks to the community's unwavering support. Named after Daisy, the initiative aimed to rescue and rehome abused and neglected animals while raising awareness about the issues they faced. The clinic became a hub of activity, with volunteers joining the cause and events organized to educate the public. Despite the successes, the team remained vigilant. The network they had exposed was vast, and there were still many unanswered questions. But as they looked at Daisy and her puppies, now thriving and ready for adoption, they knew their work had already made a difference. As the foundation's launch event approached, Emily stood before the clinic staff, reflecting on their journey. "This all started with Daisy," she said. "One dog, one story. But it's grown into something so much bigger. We've shown that compassion and determination can change lives, not just for animals, but for everyone involved." The room erupted in applause, a testament to the unity and purpose that had carried them through the toughest of times. The day of the foundation's launch event had finally arrived. The clinic was bustling with activity as staff, volunteers, and supporters gathered to celebrate what they had achieved together. The main event was set in a large outdoor space, decorated with banners and photos of Daisy and other rescued animals, showcasing their transformation and resilience. Emily and Brian stood near the main stage, watching as guests arrived. Daisy, now a picture of health, sat proudly beside her pen, her puppies playfully tumbling over one another. Scout lay close by, his quiet confidence shining through. The sight was heartwarming, a symbol of everything they had worked for. Dr. Everett took the stage, his voice steady yet filled with emotion as he addressed the crowd. This journey began with one dog, a mother fighting to protect her unborn pups in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Daisy's story is a testament to the power of compassion and determination. And it's a reminder that every life, no matter how small, is worth fighting for. The crowd erupted in applause, their faces reflecting a shared sense of purpose. But even as the atmosphere buzzed with positivity, Emily couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. The anonymous threats the clinic had received in the weeks leading up to the event still weighed heavily on her mind. As the speeches continued, a commotion near the entrance caught Emily's attention. A group of men dressed in UN